The moving truck's departure left an emptiness that echoed through Avery Elizabeth Malone's bones. Standing in her new apartment, surrounded by towers of cardboard boxes labeled in her precise handwriting, she fought the urge to draw the curtains. The late afternoon sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors of her refuge in coastal Boston. At 32, starting over felt like admitting defeat. The divorce papers, filed away in a manila envelope at the bottom of a box marked important documents, carried the weight of her shattered trust. Richard's betrayal, finding him with his young assistant in their bed, had carved hollow spaces inside her that even time couldn't seem to fill. Avery pulled her chocolate brown hair into a messy bun, securing it with the pen she'd been unconsciously chewing. Her green-gray eyes, reflected in the window glass, looked tired. The oversized cream sweater and worn jeans felt like armor, protecting her from a world that suddenly seemed too sharp, too bright. One box at a time, she whispered to herself, a mantra she'd developed over the past few months. As a freelance editorial reviewer, she'd learned to break down massive manuscripts into manageable chunks. Now she applied the same principle to rebuilding her life. The old building creaked and settled around her, its pre-war charm evident in the crown molding and the slightly uneven floors. She'd chosen this place precisely because it felt nothing like the sleek, modern condo she'd shared with Richard. Here, in this smaller space, she could disappear, focus on her work, and maybe, eventually, finish writing her own book. A movement caught her eye through the window. In the building across the narrow street, a figure passed by a corresponding window. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of confidence that came from physical strength rather than ego. Avery found herself holding her breath as the man paused, his silhouette backlit by warm interior lighting. He was stunning. There was no other word for it. Even from this distance, she could see the definition in his arms, exposed by a simple black t-shirt. Dark, slightly wavy hair fell across his forehead as he reached up to adjust something above the window. His movements were deliberate, almost graceful despite his imposing size. Avery stepped back quickly when she realized she was staring, her heart pounding with an unwelcome flutter of attraction. The last thing she needed was to develop a window-watching habit, especially not of some gorgeous stranger who, their eyes met. The connection lasted only a second before she retreated further into her apartment, but it felt like a physical touch. His eyes had been dark, intense, and somehow sad. They held the kind of depth that made her writer's mind spin with possibilities. "Stop it," she muttered, forcing herself to turn away. She had manuscripts to review, boxes to unpack, and a life to reconstruct. She didn't have time for mysterious neighbors or the way their glances made her pulse quicken. But as she worked through the evening, organizing her home office and setting up her workspace, she found her gaze drawn back to the window. The man appeared periodically, going about his evening routine. He worked out on a mat near the window, the movements controlled and powerful. Later, he stood at what appeared to be a kitchen counter, eating alone and reading something on his phone. It struck her how solitary he seemed. Not lonely exactly, but containing a kind of purposeful solitude that resonated with her own. As night fell, Avery finally allowed herself to close the curtains. She curled up on her newly assembled bed with her laptop, trying to focus on the romantic comedy manuscript she was supposed to be reviewing. The words blurred together as her mind wandered to dark eyes and strong hands. Her phone buzzed. A text from her best friend Madeline. "Settled in yet? Please tell me you're not stress organizing your bookshelf by color again." Avery smiled, typing back. "No color coding. Yet. But I might have developed a slight window-watching problem." The response came quickly. "OMG. Spill. Hot neighbor?" She hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. How could she explain the strange energy she'd felt in that brief eye contact? The way his presence seemed to fill not just his apartment, but somehow reach across the street into hers? "Maybe," she wrote back. "But I'm not looking, not ready. Honey, you don't have to marry him. Just appreciate the view." Avery put her phone down, but Madeline's words lingered. She found herself standing at the window again, drawn like a moth to flame. The light in his apartment was still on, and she could see him sitting in what looked like a comfortable chair, headphones on, eyes closed. Something about his expression spoke of grief. Or maybe she was just projecting her own pain onto the stranger's face. She watched as he reached up and ran a hand through his hair, the simple gesture somehow both vulnerable and masculine. Then, as if sensing her gaze, his eyes opened and found hers unerringly across the distance. This time, neither of them looked away immediately. In that suspended moment, Avery felt seen, really seen, for the first time since her divorce. Not as a victim, not as a project to be fixed, but as herself. The moment broke when a fire truck's siren wailed nearby. To her surprise, the man stood up quickly, gathering what looked like gear. Minutes later, she saw him emerge from his building, joining other firefighters as they rushed past. A firefighter. Of course he was a firefighter. Avery finally stepped, away from the window, pressing her cool fingers to her warm cheeks. This was dangerous territory, developing any kind of interest in someone, even from a safe distance. She had walls up for a reason, protective barriers built from the ruins of her marriage. But as she lay in bed that night, listening to the city sounds and the unfamiliar creaks of her new home, she couldn't stop thinking about those dark eyes, about the way he'd looked at her, not through her, not past her, but into her. One box at a time, she reminded herself firmly, but as sleep finally claimed her, she dreamed of windows and whispered glances, of strong hands and gentle eyes, of bridges built across the spaces between buildings and hearts. Tomorrow, she decided, she would keep the curtains closed. But even as she made that resolution, some quiet part of her knew it was already too late. The window was open, literally and metaphorically, and something had already begun to flutter across that gap between their buildings, something as delicate as hope and as dangerous as desire. Cassian Andrew Doyle's alarm went off at 4:30 a.m., but he was already awake. The nightmare, always the same one, had jolted him from sleep an hour earlier. His sister's voice calling his name, the roar of flames, the crushing weight of failure. He'd spent that hour doing push-ups on his living room floor, trying to exhaust his body enough to quiet his mind. The pre-dawn darkness pressed against his windows as he moved through his morning routine. Coffee first, black and strong enough to strip paint. Then a shower hot enough to steam up the bathroom mirror, though he barely glanced at his reflection as he toweled off and pulled on his uniform. But this morning, something was different. As he passed by his living room window, his eyes were drawn to movement in the building across the street. His new neighbor, the woman with eyes like storm clouds, was up early too. She sat cross-legged on what looked like a yoga mat, illuminated by a single lamp, her head bent over a laptop. Cassian paused, coffee mug halfway to his lips. She looked, soft in the warm light, wearing an oversized sweater that slipped off one shoulder. Her hair fell in waves around her face as she concentrated, occasionally reaching up to tuck a strand behind her ear. The gesture was unconscious, intimate, and it hit him somewhere deep in his chest. He'd noticed her moving in 2 days ago, watched her methodical unpacking and the way she kept glancing at her phone like it might bite her. There was a story there, written in the tension of her shoulders and the careful way she moved through her space, as if trying not to disturb the air around her. His phone buzzed, a text from his captain about an upcoming shift change. Cassian forced himself to step away from the window, though his awareness of her presence lingered like the steam from his shower. At the station, his partner Miguel noticed his distraction during equipment checks. Earth to Doyle, Miguel waved a hand in front of his face. "You're a million miles away, man. What's up?" Cassian shook his head, focusing on checking the oxygen tanks. "Nothing. Just didn't sleep great." Miguel's expression softened with understanding. They'd worked together long enough for him to recognize the signs. "The dream again?" "Always the dream." Cassian's voice was quiet but firm, closing the topic. The morning passed in a blur of routine calls. A kitchen fire caused by unattended cooking, a false alarm at an office building, an elderly woman who'd fallen and couldn't reach her phone. Cassian moved through each situation with the focused efficiency that had earned him respect among his colleagues, even if they sometimes called him the quiet one behind his back. It wasn't until their lunch break that Miguel brought up what he'd really been wanting to discuss. "Listen," he said, pushing aside his empty sandwich wrapper. "Regina's been asking about you. Says you haven't been to Sunday dinner in weeks." Cassian tensed. Miguel's wife had taken it upon herself to adopt him after learning about his sister, convinced that what he needed was family meals and gentle mothering. Her kindness made him uncomfortable, not because it wasn't genuine, but because it was. "Been busy," he muttered, but Miguel wasn't having it. "You can't keep living like a monk, Cass. Lauren wouldn't have wanted—" "Don't." The word came out sharper than he intended, making a couple of other firefighters glance their way. Cassian lowered his voice. "Just don't." Miguel raised his hands in surrender, but his eyes were concerned. "All I'm saying is it's been 3 years. Maybe it's time to—" The alarm cut through their conversation, and Cassian had never been more grateful for its piercing wail. They were on their feet instantly, sliding down the poles and suiting up with practiced speed. Hours later, exhausted and smoke-stained, Cassian finally made it home. The call had been a bad one, not because of the fire itself, which they'd contained quickly, but because of the little girl's screams for her cat. He'd found the animal hiding under a bed, terrified but alive. The girl's tears of joy had hit. Too close to home, bringing back memories he'd rather forget. He stripped off his clothes and stepped into the shower, letting the water pound against his shoulders. When he finally emerged, skin pink from the heat, he didn't bother with more than a towel around his waist. The weight of the day sat heavy on his chest, making him crave the solitude of his evening routine. Jazz music, maybe some reading, definitely no thinking. That's when he saw her again. She was at her window, a cup of something steaming in her hands, looking out at the city. Lights. Her face was thoughtful, almost sad. And Cassian found himself wondering what put that expression there. Then her eyes shifted, met his, and widened with sudden realization. He was still wearing only the towel. The proper thing would have been to step back immediately, apologize somehow, but he found himself frozen. Her cheeks flushed pink, visible even across the distance. But she didn't look away either, not for one long, charged moment that seemed to stretch between their windows, like a live wire. Then she spun around, almost spilling her drink, and disappeared into the darkness of her apartment. Seconds later, her curtains slid shut with decisive force. Cassian stood there for another moment, water dripping from his hair onto his shoulders, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. A spark of genuine amusement mixed with an interest that went beyond mere physical attraction. There had been something endearing about her flustered reaction, something real that cut through his usual emotional numbness. He got dressed slowly, mind replaying the moment. The way she'd looked at him hadn't felt invasive or crude. Instead, there had been a kind of startled appreciation in her gaze that made him feel seen. Not just his body, which he treated as a tool for his work more than anything else, but something deeper. The jazz playlist he usually listened to felt wrong tonight. Instead, he found himself sitting in his favorite chair, headphones on but no music playing, just thinking about the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, about the soft sweater she wore like armor, about the loneliness he recognized in her because it matched his own. His phone lit up with another text from Miguel. Sunday dinner. No excuses. Regina's. Making lasagna. For the first time in months, Cassian considered accepting, not because he was ready to be social, but because something had shifted inside him. That brief window encounter had cracked open a door he'd thought was permanently sealed. He got up and walked to the window. Her curtains were still firmly closed, but light leaked around the edges, telling him she was still awake. On impulse, he opened his own curtains wider, turned on an extra lamp. An invitation, maybe, or just an acknowledgement. Later, as he lay in bed, he realized he hadn't thought about Lauren's death once since seeing his neighbor at her window. The guilt hit immediately. How could he let himself be distracted from his grief, even for a moment? But mixed with the guilt was something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. Cassian closed his eyes, knowing sleep would be elusive. But instead of his usual nightmares, his mind kept drifting to storm cloud eyes and flushed cheeks, to the way she'd looked at him like he was a person worth seeing. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd make sure to be more careful about the towel situation. But some quiet part of him hoped she'd be at her window again, drinking her evening tea, existing in parallel with his solitude until their worlds inevitably collided. 3 days. Avery had kept her curtains firmly closed for 3 days since the incident, as she'd started calling it in her head. 3 days of carefully avoiding any glimpse of her impossibly attractive neighbor and his everything. 3 days of pretending she couldn't still see the water droplets trailing down his chest, the way the towel had hung dangerously low on his hips, the unexpected vulnerability in his eyes when they'd met hers. Focus, she muttered, staring at her laptop screen. The manuscript she was supposed to be reviewing, a psychological thriller that was neither psychological nor thrilling, blurred before her eyes. Instead of plot holes, all she could think about were hole-in-the-wall coffee shops where she might run into a certain firefighter, or whether the local gym might be the one he used. Her phone chirped with an incoming email. Another job offer, this one for a romance novel. Avery almost laughed at the universe's sense of humor. The summer heat pressed against her closed curtains, making her small apartment feel even smaller. The air conditioning hummed weakly, fighting a losing battle against the Boston humidity. She got up to get a glass of water, then stopped dead in her tracks. The power went out. The sudden silence was absolute. Her AC unit's death rattle faded to nothing, leaving only the sound of her own breathing and the distant wail of car horns as traffic signals presumably went dark. Avery fumbled for her phone, using its light to navigate to her kitchen drawer where she kept emergency supplies. The beam revealed half a protein bar, some batteries, and exactly 0 flashlights. Perfect, she sighed, leaning against her counter. The heat was already building, making her tank top stick to her skin. She had 2 choices: stay in her increasingly stifling apartment, or venture out into what was likely a neighborhood-wide blackout. A crash from somewhere down the hall made the decision for her. The thought of sitting alone in the dark while strange noises echoed through the old building was too much. Grabbing her keys and phone, she headed for the stairs. The emergency. Lights cast an eerie glow in the stairwell. Other residents were making their way down too, a mix of annoyed muttering and nervous laughter echoing off the walls. Avery kept close to the wall, counting steps, trying not to think about how the darkness reminded her of those final days in her old apartment, when she'd hidden from Richard's attempts to explain. Outside, the street was chaos of a different kind. People spilled from buildings, gathering in clusters on the sidewalk. The summer sun was setting, painting the powerless buildings in shades of orange and pink. Without air conditioning, windows that had been sealed all summer were being thrown open, letting out the accumulated heat. Avery found a spot against a wall, away from the largest groups. She pulled up her phone's weather app, wondering how long the heat wave was supposed to last. That's when she felt it, the weight of someone's gaze. She looked up. He stood across the street in front of his building, still in his uniform pants and a white t-shirt that the setting sun turned golden. Their eyes met with the same electric recognition as always, but this time there was nowhere to hide, no curtains to close, no screen of glass between them. A group of tourists with maps passed between them, breaking the connection. When they cleared, he was gone. Avery let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, then nearly jumped out of her skin when a deep voice spoke from beside her. Here. He stood less than 2 feet away, holding out a bottle of water. Up close, he was even more devastating. Tall, enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, with shoulders that made her want to write sonnets despite her general distaste for poetry. "Thank you," she managed, taking the bottle. Their fingers brushed. The contact sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the heat. "Power's out in a 6-block radius," he said. His voice was quiet, resonant with a slight roughness that made her think of whiskey and late nights. They're working on it, but it could be a few hours. Avery nodded, unsure what to say. How did one make small talk with a man they'd seen naked? Well, almost naked. Mostly naked. Nakedly enough that she'd spent 3 days trying to forget the exact angles of his. "I'm Cassian," he said, interrupting her increasingly dangerous train of thought. "Avery." She took a sip of water to hide her flushed cheeks. "You're a firefighter?" A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. What gave it away? The uniform, obviously, but also the way he stood, alert, aware of everything around them, ready to move at a moment's notice. The way other residents kept glancing his way, seeking reassurance from his calm presence. "Lucky guess," she said, and was rewarded with a slight deepening of his smile. A comfortable silence fell between them. Around them, the street had taken on a block party atmosphere. Someone had brought out a guitar. Children chased each other with glow sticks. The heat was still oppressive, but there was something almost magical about the way the lack of power had drawn everyone outside, away from their screens and air conditioning. "You're a writer?" he asked finally. Avery blinked in surprise. "How did you—" "The way you look out your window sometimes," he said, then seemed to catch himself. "I mean, I've noticed you working late, with manuscripts." So he'd been watching. Her too. The knowledge sent another shiver through her, this one settling low in her stomach. "I'm an editor mostly," she said. "Freelance. The writing is complicated." He nodded like he understood complicated. Another silence fell, but this one felt charged, full of things unsaid. Avery found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight tension in his shoulders. He looked like a man carrying weights no one could see. "Listen," he said suddenly, reaching into his pocket. "I should check on some of the elderly residents, but—" He pulled out a small notepad, the kind first responders carried, and wrote something on it. The movement of his hands was decisive but gentle, at odds with their obvious strength. He tore out the page and held it out to her. "In case the power stays out," he said, "or in case it doesn't." Avery took the paper, careful not to let their fingers touch again. She wasn't sure she could handle that twice in one conversation. His phone number was written in strong, clean strokes, along with his full name, Cassian Andrew Doyle. "Thank you," she said again, folding the paper carefully and slipping it into her pocket. It felt like a secret, a possibility, a door opening just a crack. He nodded once, then turned to go. She watched him move through the crowd, stopping to check on an older woman with a cane, helping a man with his stalled car. Everything about him spoke of capability and care, and something in her chest ached at the sight. The sun had almost set now, casting long shadows across the street. Battery-powered radios competed with the guitar player. Someone had ordered pizza for the whole block. It should have felt overwhelming, so many strangers, so much noise, but instead Avery felt strangely at peace. She looked down at her phone, then at the paper in her pocket. The smart thing would be to wait, to think this through, to remember all the reasons she'd sworn off relationships, to keep her curtains closed and her heart safer. But as she watched Cassian lift a young child onto his shoulders to retrieve a balloon caught in a tree, she found herself pulling out her phone. Her fingers moved before she could second-guess herself. "Thank you for the water. Avery." She hit send before she could change her mind, then waited, heart pounding. Across the street, she saw him pause and reach for his phone. Even in the growing darkness, she could see his smile. The reply came moments later. "Thank you for not calling the police about the towel incident." Avery laughed out loud, surprising herself. A few people turned to look, including Cassian. The way he was looking at her made her feel both seen and safe, a combination she hadn't experienced in longer than she cared to remember. When the power finally came back on 2 hours later, Avery returned to her apartment with more than just relief from the heat. She had a phone number burning a hole in her pocket, the memory of a smile that reached all the way to dark eyes, and the dangerous feeling that maybe, just maybe, Some risks were worth taking. She walked to her window, and for the first time, in 3 days opened the curtains. Across the street, a light came on in Cassian's apartment. He was there, looking back at her. Neither of them moved to close their curtains. Sometimes, Avery thought, a blackout could illuminate things that had been hidden in the light. Cassian's phone buzzed at 5:43 a.m., just as he was finishing his morning workout. He'd been up since 4, unable to sleep, thoughts circling around. A certain editor in the text conversation they'd had until well past midnight. Coffee? The message read. I know a place that opens early, really early. His heart did something complicated in his chest. She was awake too. Had she also been thinking about their late-night exchange? About how they'd moved from awkward, blackout small talk to sharing pieces of themselves one text at a time? Where? He typed back, then added, I'm already up. Been there, done that. The little place 2 blocks down. 15 minutes? Cassian looked at himself in the mirror, sweat damp from his workout, wearing old gym clothes. Make it 20, he replied. In the shower, he tried not to overthink things, but memories of their texts kept floating through his mind. She'd told him about growing up in Maine, about her dream of writing a novel about family secrets and second chances. He'd shared stories about his rookie days as a firefighter, carefully avoiding any mention of Lauren. He'd made her laugh 3 times. He'd counted. The coffee shop was tucked between a bookstore and a vintage clothing shop, its windows still, dark except for the warm glow of pendant lights inside. Avery stood outside wearing jeans and an oversized cardigan despite the early summer heat. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she was biting her lower lip, checking her phone. Hi, he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, and the smile that spread across her face hit him like a physical force. Hi, she replied, tucking her phone away. I was starting to worry you'd changed your mind. I wouldn't. The words came out more intense than he'd intended. To cover the moment, he reached for the door, holding it open for her. Inside, the cafe smelled of freshly ground coffee and something baking. The barista, a college-aged kid with bright blue hair, nodded at them. Morning, Avery, the usual? You're a regular? Cassian asked as they found a table in the corner. I keep weird hours, she admitted, and Riley here doesn't judge me for ordering coffee at ungodly times. Never, Riley called from behind the counter. What can I get for your friend? Black coffee, Cassian said. Strong as you can make it. Ah, a firefighter special. Riley grinned. Coming right up. Avery raised an eyebrow. They know your order too? Most places around here do. Fire station's just a few blocks away. There, drinks arrived. His black coffee and what appeared to be some kind of caramel latte creation for her. The morning light was starting to seep through the windows, catching the gold highlights in her hair. She wrapped both hands around her mug, and Cassian noticed she wasn't wearing any rings. So, she said, meeting his eyes. Couldn't sleep either? I usually get up early. Usually this early? He smiled slightly. No, not usually this early. A comfortable silence fell as they sipped their drinks. Outside, the city was starting to wake up. Early morning joggers passed by. Delivery trucks rumbled past. Birds called from their perches on power lines. Can I ask you something? Avery's voice was hesitant. When he nodded, she continued. Last night, in your texts, you mentioned that Jazz helps with the nightmares. Do you want to talk about them? Cassian's hand tightened on his mug. Part of him wanted to deflect, to change the subject, but something about the quiet morning light, about the way she was looking at him, not with pity but with genuine care, made him want to try. They're about my sister, he said finally. About the night she died. Avery didn't say anything, but her hand moved across the table, not quite touching his but close enough that he could feel its warmth. It was 3 years ago, he continued, the words coming slowly. There was a fire in her apartment building. I was first on scene. I got to her door, but he took a deep breath. The ceiling collapsed. By the time we got through, it was too late. You were there. Avery whispered. That must have been. Yeah. He couldn't look at her. Everyone said it wasn't my fault, that I did everything I could. But she was my little sister. I was supposed to protect her. Her hand covered his then, warm and solid and real. What was her name? Lauren. His voice cracked slightly on the name. She was 26, used to make these terrible puns that would drive me crazy. Had a cat named Professor Whiskers. Loved sunflowers. Avery's thumb moved in small circles on the back of his hand. The touch was grounding, pulling him back from the edge of darker memories. Thank you, she said softly, for telling me about her. He looked at her then, really looked. The morning light made her eyes clearer, more gray than green. There was something in them, understanding maybe, or recognition of pain. Your turn, he said gently. She withdrew her hand, wrapping it back around her mug. My turn? Something keeps you up at night, too. I can see it in the way you watch the street sometimes, like you're looking for shadows. Avery took a long sip of her drink, then set it down carefully. I was married, she said, for 5 years to a man named Richard. It ended badly. Cassian waited, letting her find her words. I came home early one day. Had a migraine. Decided to skip my afternoon meetings. Her voice was steady, but her fingers were white-knuckled around her mug. Found him in our bed with his assistant. She was 22, wearing my favorite sweater. Anger flared in Cassian's chest. Not hot and fast like during a fire, but slow and cold. The kind that made him want to find this Richard and... The worst part wasn't even the cheating, Avery continued. It was realizing that everyone knew. His friends, our neighbors, probably half my colleagues. Everyone but me. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I felt so stupid, so blind. You weren't stupid, Cassian said, his voice low and fierce. He was the blind one. She looked up, startled by his tone. Their eyes met and held, and something electric passed between them. Understanding, recognition, the weight of shared pain and the possibility of something lighter. The moment was broken by Riley approaching with fresh coffees. On the house, they said, clearing away the empty mugs. You, too, looked like you could use a refill. Thanks, Riley. Avery smiled, but her eyes kept drifting back to Cassian. They spent the next hour talking about lighter things. His captain's terrible jokes, her current manuscript about a detective who could talk to houseplants, the best pizza place in the neighborhood. But something had shifted between them. Deeper connection forged in the quiet morning light. When Cassian's phone buzzed with a message from the station, they both knew their time was up. I have to go, he said, reluctant to break the spell of the morning. I know. Avery stood, gathering her cardigan closer despite the growing heat outside. Thank you for everything. They walked to the door together, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Outside, the city was fully awake now, the streets filling with commuters and construction noise. Avery, Cassian said just as she started to turn away. She looked back and the morning sun caught her face, making her eyes luminous. Would you have dinner with me? Tonight? Her smile bloomed, slowly like a flower opening to the sun. Yes, she said simply. I'd like that. He watched her walk away, her hair catching the light, her steps lighter than they'd been earlier. Something in his chest felt lighter too, as if sharing the weight of his grief had somehow made it more bearable. His phone buzzed again, Miguel asking where he was. But before he headed to the station, Cassian looked up at the windows of their buildings now bright in the morning sun. The curtains were open on both sides, and somehow, that felt like a promise. Avery stood in front of her closet, surrounded by discarded outfits, while Madeline's voice came through her phone speaker. You're overthinking this, her friend said, amusement clear in her tone. It's dinner, not a presidential debate. I know, but... Avery held up a navy blue dress, then tossed it aside. This morning was different. We talked. Really talked. I don't want to mess this up. By wearing the wrong dress? by sending the wrong message. Avery sat on her bed, pushing aside a pile of rejected clothes. Too casual says I'm not taking this seriously. Too formal says I'm trying too hard. Too revealing says you're a woman who's attracted to the hot firefighter next door? Madeline interrupted. Because, honey, that ship sailed when you saw him in nothing but a towel. Maddie. Am I wrong? Avery glanced at her window where she could see Cassian's apartment. His lights were off. He was still at the station. Their morning coffee conversation kept replaying in her mind. The way he'd talked about his sister, the pain in his eyes, the gentle strength in his hands as they'd wrapped around his coffee mug. No, she admitted quietly. You're not wrong. Then wear the green wrap dress, the one that makes your eyes pop. And Avery? It's okay to want this. To want him. After hanging up, Avery found herself staring at her reflection. The green dress did look good, falling just above her knees, wrapping around her waist in a way that was flattering without being obvious. She'd left her hair down but tamed the waves with product, and for the first time in months she'd put on makeup that wasn't just concealer and mascara. Her phone buzzed with a text from Cassian. Just finished shift. Meet you at 7? She typed back, I'll be ready. The restaurant he'd chosen was a small Italian place a few blocks away, tucked into the bottom floor of a converted brownstone. When Avery arrived, Cassian was already waiting outside. He'd changed from his uniform into dark jeans and a charcoal gray button-down that made his shoulders look even broader, if that was possible. Hi, she said, suddenly shy despite their hours of texting and their intimate morning conversation. He turned, and the look in his eyes when he saw her made her breath catch. Hi, he replied, his voice warm. You look beautiful. Inside, the restaurant was cozy and dimly lit, with exposed brick walls and candles on every table. Their server, an older woman named Maria, led them to a corner table partially screened by a trellis covered in fake grapevines. The manicotti is excellent tonight, Maria told them with a wink before leaving them with their menus. I hope Italian is okay, Cassian said, watching her face. I should have asked. It's perfect. Avery smiled. Though I should warn you, I'm physically incapable of eating pasta without getting sauce somewhere inappropriate. His laugh was unexpected and rich, transforming his whole face. I'll protect you from any marinara-related wardrobe disasters. The wine arrived, a red he'd selected with quiet confidence, and Avery found herself relaxing into the evening. There was something about Cassian's presence that made her feel both excited and safe, like standing at the edge of an adventure knowing someone would catch her if she fell. So, she said, after they'd ordered, do you bring all your dates to this hidden gem? Something flickered in his eyes. I don't date much, he admitted. After Lauren, it was easier to focus on work. And now? He looked at her steadily. Now I'm having dinner with you. The simplicity of his answer, the weight of honesty behind it, made her heart skip. Before she could respond, their appetizers arrived, bruschetta that smelled of fresh basil and garlic. What about you? He asked, breaking a piece of bread. After Richard. One date, she said. 6 months ago, he spent the entire time talking about his CrossFit routine and his crypto investments. She took a sip of wine. I may have faked a work emergency to escape. Smart woman. Survival instinct. She smiled, but then grew serious. The truth is I didn't trust myself. Still don't, sometimes. I thought I was a good judge of character, before Richard, but he fooled you, Cassian finished quietly. Yeah. She looked down at her plate. Makes it hard to believe your own instincts after something like that. What do your instincts say now? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Avery looked up, meeting his eyes across the candlelight. They say you're different, she said softly. They say you're real. The moment was interrupted by Maria bringing their main courses, manicotti for her, lasagna for him. The food was as excellent as promised, but Avery found herself more aware of every small detail of Cassian. The way he cut his food with precise movements. How he waited for her to take the first bite. The slight smile when she inevitably got sauce on her chin. "Here," he said, reaching across with his napkin to dab at the spot. The gesture was both intimate and innocent, and it made her skin tingle where the fabric touched. Their conversation flowed easily through dinner, moving from childhood memories, his first time on a fire truck at age 7, her secret treehouse where she wrote stories, to current passions, his love of jazz, her collection of first editions, to dreams they'd never told anyone else. "I want to write about second chances," she found herself saying as they shared a tiramisu. "Not just romance, but real transformation. The kind that happens after you think you've lost everything." "Like a phoenix," he said thoughtfully. "Exactly. Rising from the ashes, but changed. Stronger maybe, but also more vulnerable. More real." He was quiet for a moment, pushing the dessert toward her to finish. "I think," he said finally, "that's the only kind of strength that matters. The kind that comes from being broken and choosing to stay open anyway." Their eyes met across the table, and Avery felt something shift between them. A deepening, a recognition. This wasn't just attraction or compatibility. This was something more dangerous, more precious. When they left the restaurant, the summer night was warm and star-filled. They walked slowly, neither wanting the evening to end. Their hands brushed, once, twice before Cassian caught hers in his. His palm was warm and slightly calloused, and his fingers interlaced with hers as if they'd been doing this for years. At her building's entrance, they stopped. The streetlight cast soft shadows across his face, making him look younger, more vulnerable. "Thank you for dinner," she said, not letting go of his hand. "Thank you for saying yes." He stepped closer, and Avery felt her heart begin to race. The height difference between them meant she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, but before she could, his free hand came up to cup her cheek. "Avery," he said, his voice low and rough. "I'm going to kiss you now, unless you tell me not to," she answered by rising on her tiptoes, pressing her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, a question more than a demand, but when she made a small sound in the back of her throat, his arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer. The world narrowed to points of sensation, his mouth on hers, warm and certain, his hands spanning her back through the thin fabric of her dress, the solid wall of his chest against hers. She tasted wine and coffee and something uniquely him, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily. "Wow," she whispered, not moving from the circle of his arms. He pressed his forehead to hers, his eyes closed as if memorizing the moment. "Yeah," he agreed roughly. "Wow." Later, after more kisses and whispered goodnights, Avery stood at her window. Across the street, she could see Cassian in his apartment, phone to his ear. As if sensing her gaze, he turned and saw her. Even across the distance, his smile made her knees weak. She touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the ghost of his kiss. Outside her window, the city hummed with life. But all she could focus on was the man across the street, the taste of tiramisu and possibility, and the dangerous, wonderful feeling that maybe, just maybe, some risks were worth taking twice. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of stolen moments and growing intimacy. Coffee before Cassian's early shifts. Quick lunches when their schedules aligned. Long evening walks through the neighborhood, hands intertwined, learning each other's rhythms. And always their windows open, a constant connection even when they were apart. But tonight was different. Tonight, Cassian had invited her to Sunday dinner at Miguel and Regina's. "You don't have to come," he'd said when he asked her, his voice carefully neutral. "It's just that Regina's been asking about you and—" "I want to," Avery had interrupted, even as butterflies took flight in her stomach. Meeting his closest friends felt significant, like crossing a threshold she couldn't uncross. Now, standing outside the cheerful yellow house in suburban Boston, those butterflies had turned into pterodactyls. Cassian must have sensed her tension, because he squeezed her hand. "They're going to love you." he said softly. Before she could respond, the front door flew open. Regina was a whirlwind of energy in a floral apron, her dark curls escaping from a messy bun. "Finally," she exclaimed, pulling Cassian into a hug before turning to Avery. "And you must be the window girl." "Regina," Cassian groaned, but there was affection in his voice. "What?" That's how Miguel described her. "Cass is dating the pretty girl from the window across the street." She wrapped Avery in an unexpected but warm embrace. "I'm just happy he's finally letting someone in." Inside, the house was organized chaos. Two young children, Regina and Miguel's daughters, raced through the living room wielding plastic dinosaurs. The smell of garlic and tomatoes filled the air, and salsa music played softly in the background. Miguel emerged from the kitchen, grinning. "The famous Avery. Now we can finally hear your side of the towel story." "Nobody's telling that story," Cassian said firmly, but his hand found the small of Avery's back, warm and steadying. Dinner was a lively affair. Regina had made her famous enchiladas, and conversation flowed as easily as the wine. Avery found herself relaxing, drawn in by the family's obvious affection for each other and for Cassian. "He's different with you," Regina said quietly when they were clearing plates. The men had taken the girls outside to look at Miguel's new telescope. "More present, less haunted?" Avery suggested. Regina nodded. "Lauren's death hit him hard. He blamed himself, withdrew from everyone, started working crazy hours taking the most dangerous calls." She glanced out the window where Cassian was lifting the younger daughter to see through the telescope. "This is the first time in 3 years I've seen him smile like that." Avery's heart squeezed. "He's special," she said simply. "So are you, honey." Regina touched her arm. "The way he looks at you, just don't give up on him, okay? Even when he tries to push you away." Before Avery could ask what she meant, Cassian's phone rang. From the way his posture changed as he answered it, she knew it was the station. He came inside quickly. "There's a big fire downtown, all units called in." His eyes found Avery's. "I have to go." "Of course." She tried to keep her voice steady, but fear had already begun to curl in her stomach. "I'll drive you home first." "No," she cut him off. "Go. I'll get an Uber." He hesitated, then pulled her into a fierce kiss that tasted of goodbye. "I'll text you when I can." Then he was gone, leaving Avery standing in Regina's kitchen, her lips tingling and her heart racing with a new kind of fear. "First fire?" Regina asked gently. Avery nodded. "Come on," Regina said, leading her to the couch. "We'll wait together." Hours passed. Miguel, also a firefighter but off duty with a sprained ankle, kept checking his phone for updates. The girls were put to bed. Regina made tea that grew cold in their cups, and Avery learned what it meant to love someone who ran toward danger instead of away from it. Around midnight, Regina turned on the news. The fire had started in an old warehouse and spread to neighboring buildings. Footage showed flames lighting up the night sky, firefighters looking tiny against the inferno. "Turn it off," Miguel said sharply when they showed a section of roof collapse. Avery's phone buzzed. Her heart leaped, but it was just Madeline checking in. She tried to respond, but her hands were shaking too badly to type. "The first one is the hardest," Regina said, taking Avery's cold hands in hers. "But you learn to trust their training, their team, and you learn to trust them to come home." "How do you do it?" Avery whispered. "How do you love someone knowing that every shift could be—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Regina understood. Because not loving them would be worse. Because they do this impossible, brave thing, and they need someone to come home to. Someone who understands both their strength and their scars. Another hour crawled by. Avery thought about Lauren, about how Cassian hadn't been able to save her, about how that loss shaped every choice he made, every risk he took. She thought about his hands, so gentle when they held hers, now gripping hoses and climbing ladders. About his eyes, which saw through all her defenses, now staring into flames. Finally, At nearly 2 in the morning, Avery's phone lit up with a text, "Safe, exhausted, can I see you?" She was already grabbing her coat. Miguel insisted on driving her home, and the ride passed in tense silence. When they pulled up to her building, he turned to her. "You're good for him," he said gruffly. "Just be patient. Big fires like this, they bring up memories. He might try to push you away." Avery thought about Regina's earlier warning. "I'm not going anywhere." In her apartment, she paced, watching Cassian's dark windows. 20 minutes later, she heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. She opened her door before he could knock. He stood there in his civilian clothes, but she could smell smoke on him, see exhaustion in every line of his body. His eyes were haunted in a way she hadn't seen before. "I should let you rest," she started to say, but he shook his head. "Can I?" His voice was hoarse. "Can I just hold you? For a minute?" She pulled him inside, into her arms. He buried his face in her neck, and she felt him shaking. Not crying, just trembling with adrenaline crash and emotion. "We lost too," he whispered against her skin. "I couldn't." The smoke was too thick. "Shh," she soothed, running her fingers through his damp hair. "You did everything you could." "Like with Lauren?" The words were bitter, self-loathing. Avery pulled back enough to frame his face with her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Yes," she said firmly. "Like with Lauren. You are not responsible for the fires, Cassian. You're just the one brave enough to fight them." Something broke in his expression. He kissed her then, hard and desperate, tasting of smoke and fear. She kissed him back, trying to pour everything she felt into it. Pride, worry, understanding, and something deeper that she wasn't quite ready to name. Later they lay on her couch, his head in her lap as she stroked his hair. The sky was beginning to lighten outside her windows. Across the street, his apartment stood dark and empty. "Stay," she whispered. He didn't answer, but he didn't leave, either. And as the sun rose over Boston, Avery watched him finally sleep, his hand curled around hers like an anchor. She thought about what Regina had said, about loving someone who ran toward danger, about understanding both their strength and their scars. Looking down at Cassian's sleeping face, peaceful for the first time in hours, she realized she was already past the point of no return. This was what falling in love felt like. Not the careful, controlled affection she'd had with Richard, but something wild and terrifying and beautiful. Something worth fighting for, even if sometimes that meant fighting Cassian's own demons alongside him. A month into their relationship, Avery was learning Cassian's rhythms, the way he always woke before his alarm, how he needed silence after difficult shifts, the specific tension in his shoulders that meant Lauren was heavy on his mind. But she was also learning that love didn't automatically heal old wounds. Sometimes it just brought them closer to the surface. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning. Avery was at Been There, Done That, working on her novel while waiting for Cassian to finish his shift. The familiar ping barely registered until she saw the sender's name. Richard Maxwell. Her coffee turned to acid in her stomach. Subject: "Can we talk?" Her finger hovered over the delete button, but something made her open it. "Avery, I've been thinking about us, about my mistakes. I miss you. The company isn't the same without you. Neither is my life. Can we meet? Just to talk. I owe you an explanation and so much more." "Richard." "You okay?" Riley asked, appearing at her table with a fresh coffee. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," Avery managed. The bell above the door chimed and Cassian walked in. One look at her face and he was immediately alert, crossing to her table in long strides. "What's wrong?" She turned her laptop toward him wordlessly. His expression darkened as he read, jaw tightening. "Are you going to meet him?" His voice was carefully neutral. I don't know." She closed her laptop. "Part of me wants answers. Why he did it. If anything in our marriage was real." Cassian sat down, his posture rigid. "And the other part?" "Is terrified of letting him back into my life in any way." She reached for his hand across the table. I'm not interested in reconciliation, you know that, right? He nodded, but something had shifted in his eyes. A shadow she recognized, the same one that appeared when he talked about Lauren, about not being able to save her. It's your decision, he said finally. But whatever you choose, I'm here. The rest of the morning felt off kilter. They went through their usual routine: breakfast, a walk through the park, but there was a new tension between them. Avery caught Cassian watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. That evening, she was reviewing a manuscript when movement caught her eye. Through their windows, she saw Cassian in his apartment, pacing. He was shirtless, fresh from a workout, tension visible in every line of his body. Even from across the street, she could tell something was wrong. Her phone buzzed with his text. Can I come over? Minutes later, he was at her door. He'd pulled on a t-shirt but hadn't bothered with shoes, and his hair was still damp with sweat. Before she could speak, he pulled her into a kiss that was almost desperate in its intensity. Cass, she gasped when they broke apart. What's wrong? He rested his forehead against hers, breathing hard. I keep thinking about you meeting him, about him trying to win you back. That's not going to happen. You don't know that. He pulled away, running a hand through his hair. People make mistakes. They realize what they've lost. They want second chances. Understanding dawned. This isn't about Richard, is it? Cassian went still. What do you mean? This is about Lauren, about not being able to save her. Avery stepped closer, touching his arm, about being afraid you can't protect the people you love. I couldn't save her, he said, his voice raw. I was right there and I couldn't. And now, with you, I can't protect you from him either. From the pain he caused, from whatever manipulation he's planning. Hey. She framed his face with her hands, making him look at her. I don't need you to protect me from Richard. I need you to trust me to protect myself. I do trust you. I just... He closed his eyes. I can't lose anyone else. The vulnerability in his voice broke her heart. Come here, she whispered, leading him to her couch. She sat down, pulling him with her until his head was in her lap, just like that night after the big fire. When Lauren died, she said softly, running her fingers through his hair, it wasn't because you failed. It was because, sometimes terrible, things happen that we can't control. Just like my marriage didn't fail because I was blind or stupid. It failed because Richard made choices that had nothing to do with my worth. Cassian was quiet for a long moment, his breathing gradually steadying, under her touch. I don't want to be like this, he said finally. So, broken. You're not broken. She leaned down, kissing his temple. You're healing. We both are. He caught her hand, pressing it to his heart. I love you, he said quietly. I think I've loved you since that first morning at the coffee shop, when you asked about my nightmares and actually listened. Avery's heart soared, even as tears pricked her eyes. I love you too, she whispered. Not despite your scars, but including them. All of you. He sat up then, pulling her into his lap. His kiss was different this time, slower, deeper, full of promise rather than desperation. She melted into him, feeling the solid strength of his body, the gentle way he cradled her face. When they finally broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers. What are you going to do about Richard? I'm going to email him back, she said. Tell him that I don't need his explanations or his regrets, that I found something real, something worth protecting. Cassian's arms tightened around her. Yeah? Yeah. She kissed him softly. And then I'm going to finish my novel. About second chances, remember? But not the kind Richard wants, the kind we're giving ourselves. He smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his whole face. The phoenix rising from the ashes. Exactly. She traced his jaw with her fingertips. And then maybe we could talk about making this arrangement more permanent. His eyes widened slightly. You mean? I'm tired of watching you through windows. I want to wake up with you, go to sleep with you, share a coffee maker and argue about whose turn it is to do laundry. You want to live together? Only if you're ready, she said quickly. I know it's fast, and with everything with Lauren. He cut her off with a kiss that left her breathless. Yes, he said against her lips. Yes to all of it. Later that night, they lay tangled together on her couch talking about logistics, whose apartment to keep, how to combine their furniture, whether his jazz records would fit with her book collection. Through the window, they could see his apartment dark now except for the streetlights reflecting off the glass. You know what this means, Avery said, tracing patterns on his chest. No more window watching. No more silent glances across the street. Cassian pulled her closer. I think we're past needing windows to see each other, he murmured into her hair. She smiled, remembering their first real conversation. You see me? Always, he replied, echoing their beginning. Always and completely. Outside, the city hummed with life. Inside, in the quiet of her apartment, soon to be their apartment, Avery felt the last pieces of her heart's defense crumble. She had been so afraid of being hurt again, of trusting the wrong person. But loving Cassian wasn't about blind trust or desperate need. It was about choice, about seeing someone's darkness and choosing to walk beside them anyway, about letting someone see your scars and trusting them to touch them gently. As she drifted off to sleep in his arms, Avery thought about phoenixes and second chances, about how sometimes the most beautiful things could rise from the ashes of what was lost, and sometimes they lived right across the street, just waiting to be seen. Moving day dawned bright and clear, though the weather forecast promised late afternoon thunderstorms. Avery stood in her half-empty apartment surrounded by labeled boxes and the echoes of the past 2 months. The walls that had once felt like a refuge now seemed too small to contain all that had changed. Her phone buzzed with a text from Cassian. Meeting at the station ran long. Miguel's bringing the truck. I'll be there in an hour. She smiled, remembering their debate about which apartment to keep. His was bigger, with better natural light and a proper kitchen. But hers had history now. Their first kiss, their first I love you, the night they decided to build a life together. In the end, logic won over sentiment. They were keeping his place, which meant today was about saying goodbye to her windows. A knock at the door interrupted her nostalgia. Expecting Miguel, she opened it without checking the peephole. Richard stood there instead. He looked exactly as she remembered. Expensive suit, carefully styled hair, the same cologne that used to make her heart race. Now, it just made her nauseous. Hello, Avery. She gripped the doorframe. What are you doing here? You didn't answer my email. He took a step forward, forcing her to step back or be touched. I was in the neighborhood for a meeting. Thought I'd try my luck. You shouldn't be here. Her voice was steadier than she felt. Richard's eyes swept the apartment, taking in the boxes. You're moving? Is that why you ignored me? Found someone new already? The condescension in his tone sparked something in her chest. Not fear, but anger. Not that it's any of your business, but yes, I'm moving in with my boyfriend. Boyfriend? He laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. Come on, Ave, we both know you're not over us. The way things ended, she cut him off, was with you screwing your assistant in our bed. While wearing the watch I bought you for our anniversary. He had the grace to flinch. I made a mistake. I know that now. But what we had was a lie. The words came easily now, powered by months of healing and Cassian's steady love. You didn't respect me enough to be faithful, or even honest. And now you don't respect me enough to accept that I've moved on. Thunder rumbled outside, closer than expected. Richard took another step into her apartment. At least hear me out, he said, his voice taking on that reasonable tone she used to find so compelling. For old time's sake. She said you should leave. They both turned. Cassian filled the doorway, still in his uniform, his expression dangerous. Behind him, Miguel stood with his arms crossed. Richard straightened his suit jacket. This is a private conversation. No, Avery said firmly, moving to stand beside Cassian. It's not. It's trespassing. Leave, Richard. Don't contact me again. For a moment she thought he might argue. But something in Cassian's stance, or maybe in her own newfound strength, made him think better of it. You've changed, he said, almost accusingly. Yes, she agreed. I have. After he left, the tension in the room slowly dissipated. Cassian's hand found hers, squeezing gently. You okay? She leaned into his solid warmth. Better than okay. That was surprisingly satisfying. Miguel coughed. Not to interrupt the moment, but there's a storm coming and we've got a truck, full of boxes to move. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Regina arrived with the girls, turning the move into an impromptu party. They formed a human chain up the stairs, passing boxes and sharing jokes. Even Riley from the coffee shop stopped by with a care package of muffins and their favorite drinks. By late afternoon, most of Avery's belongings were in their new shared apartment. She stood at Cassian's, their windows, watching the storm roll in. The view was different from this side of the street, but no less meaningful. Having second thoughts? Cassian's arms slipped around her waist from behind. No. She leaned back against his chest. Just thinking about how much has changed since I first saw you through these windows. You mean since you first saw me naked through these windows? She elbowed him playfully. Almost naked, and I seem to remember you didn't mind being seen. I didn't. His voice turned serious. I wanted you to see me. All of me. I do. She turned in his arms. And I'm sorry about Richard showing up today. Don't be. He touched her face gently. You handled him, I just provided backup. Lightning flashed outside, followed quickly by thunder. The storm was directly overhead now, rain lashing against their windows. I should check the station, Cassian said reluctantly. Weather like this usually means extra calls. As if on cue, his phone rang. The call was brief, but she could tell from his expression what was coming. There's flooding in East Boston, he said after hanging up. They need all available units. Avery's heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady. Go. Be safe. He kissed her hard, then grabbed his gear. At the door, he paused. I love you. I love you too. She managed a smile. I'll be here when you get back. In our home. After he left, Avery stood at the windows watching the storm. She thought about Richard's visit, about how different she felt now compared to the woman who'd first moved into that apartment across the street. She was stronger now, more certain of herself. Love hadn't fixed her, it had given her space to fix herself. Her phone buzzed with a text from Regina. First storm since you moved in together. You okay? Yes, she wrote back. Worried, but okay. I understand now what you meant about loving someone who runs toward danger. It gets easier, and harder, and worth it every day. Lightning split the sky again, and Avery pressed her hand to the window glass. Somewhere out there, Cassian was helping people, facing the elements, being the hero she knew he'd always been. And here she was, in their home, being strong in a different way. By loving him enough to let him go, again and again. She turned to the boxes waiting to be unpacked. Their life together was just beginning, full of promise and possibility. Yes, there would be storms. Yes, there would be nights of worry and days of fear. But there would also be mornings of soft light and shared coffee, evenings of jazz music and quiet understanding, moments of passion and peace and everything in between. Through the rain-streaked windows, she could just make out her old apartment. The windows were dark now, waiting for new stories to unfold behind them. But her story, their story, was just beginning, full of the kind of second chances that came not from running away from the past, but from building something new from its lessons. A text from Cassian lit up her phone. heading to the flood zone. Think of me? She smiled, typing back. Always come home to me. Count on it, Phoenix. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, Avery began unpacking their books, mixing his jazz biographies with her novels, creating something new from the pieces of their separate lives. And she thought about how love was like a storm sometimes, wild and unpredictable and absolutely worth weathering, especially when you had someone to weather it with. 3 months into living together, Avery woke to an empty bed and the sound of jazz floating through their apartment. She found Cassian in the living room, sitting in the dark, staring at an old photograph. Even without turning on the lights, she knew what it was. Lauren, smiling at her college graduation, sunflowers in her arms. It's her birthday, he said without looking up. Would have been 30. Avery sat beside him, close enough to touch, but not touching. Sometimes love meant knowing when to leave space for grief. Tell me about that day, she said softly. The graduation. She was so nervous about tripping on stage. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Made me practice walking, in her heels with her the night before. Miguel has photos somewhere. I would pay good money to see those. They're probably worth a fortune in blackmail. His voice caught. She would have loved you, you know. Would have teased me endlessly about the window thing. Avery took his hand, feeling the slight tremor in his fingers. I wish I could have met her. They sat in silence as the jazz played on, until Cassian's phone buzzed with his alarm. Another shift beginning. Another day of running toward danger while carrying the weight of the past. I'll make coffee, Avery said, but he caught her arm. Thank you, he whispered, for letting me talk about her, for understanding. She kissed him softly. Always. Later that morning, after Cassian left for his shift, Avery sat at her laptop working on the final chapters of her novel. The story had evolved as she wrote it, becoming less about romantic love and more about the kind of transformation that comes from facing your deepest fears. Her protagonist, once a shadow of herself, was finally stepping into her own power. Her phone lit up with a text from Regina. Lunch today? Need your help with something. They met at a small bistro near the fire station. Regina looked unusually serious as she slid into the booth. So, she said, pulling out a folder. Miguel mentioned it's Lauren's birthday. Yeah. Avery's chest tightened. Cassian's having a hard time. He always does this time of year. Regina opened the folder, which is why I want to show you these. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Lauren through the years, from childhood to that final summer. Lauren and Cassian at the beach at family dinners making silly faces at the camera. And yes, there was even one of Cassian in heels, looking terrified and determined. These are amazing, Avery breathed. But why are you showing me? Because Cassian got rid of all his photos after she died. Couldn't bear to look at them. Regina's eyes were fierce with love and worry. But I think he's ready now, to remember her with joy instead of just pain. And I think you're part of why. Avery stared at a photo of Lauren and Cassian cooking, together both covered in flour and laughing. What do you want me to do? Help me make a memory book, not just photos, but stories too. Get Miguel and the other firefighters to contribute, maybe even track down some of her college friends. Regina squeezed her hand. He needs to know it's okay to keep her alive in his heart while still moving forward with you. He might not be ready. He might never feel ready, but healing isn't about being ready, it's about being brave enough to try. That afternoon, Avery couldn't focus on her writing. She kept thinking about the photos, about Cassian's smile in them, so much, freer than she'd ever seen. About how love sometimes meant pushing someone toward their pain instead of helping them avoid it. Her phone buzzed with a text from him. Tough call, could use your voice. She called immediately. Hey, handsome. Hey. He sounded exhausted. Lost a kid today. Couldn't get to him in time. Avery's heart broke. Where are you? Still at The station. Can't go home yet. Want me to come to you? A pause. Please. 20 minutes later, she found him in the station's quiet room, a small space set aside for firefighters to decompress after difficult calls. He was still in his gear, smelling of smoke and sweat and sadness. Come here, she said, opening her arms. He practically fell into her embrace, his big body shuddering. She held him tight, feeling the storm of emotion he usually kept so carefully contained. He was wearing Batman pajamas, he whispered against her neck, like the ones Lauren bought for my nephew last Christmas, and I couldn't. I tried so hard. I know you did. She stroked his hair. I know, love. They stayed like that for a long time, until his breathing steadied and the worst of the tremors passed. Finally, he pulled back enough to look at her. Sometimes I think about quitting, he admitted. About doing something safe, something that wouldn't risk leaving you alone. But you won't. No. He pressed his forehead to hers. Because as much as it hurts when we lose someone, it would hurt more not to try. To know there was a chance to help and not take it. That's why I love you. She touched his face. Your heart is so big, Cass. Big enough to hold all of it. The pain and the joy, the past and the future. His eyes searched hers. How did you get so wise? I learned from a very brave firefighter. She smiled softly. He taught me that healing isn't about being ready. It's about being brave enough to try. Recognition flickered in his eyes. Regina showed you the photos, didn't she? Yes. She held her breath, waiting for his reaction. To her surprise, he smiled, small but real. Should have known you two. Would conspire eventually. He was quiet for a moment. I'd like to see them, the photos, not today, but soon. Whenever you're ready, she promised. And Cass, I'd love to hear more stories about her. Not just the sad ones, but the happy ones too. The silly ones. The ones that make you smile like you did in those pictures. He pulled her close again, burying his face in her hair. I don't deserve you. Yes, you do. She held him tighter. We deserve each other. All our broken pieces and healing parts. Everything we were, and everything we're becoming. Outside the quiet room, they could hear the bustle of the station, radio chatter, boots on concrete, the ever-present possibility of another call. But in here, in this moment, they had created a different kind of safety. The kind that came from being fully seen, fully accepted, fully loved. Move in with me, he'd said, 2 months ago. Marry me, his eyes seemed to say now, though he didn't speak the words. Yes. Her heart answered anyway, already knowing that someday when he was ready she would say it out loud. For now, she just held him, letting him borrow her strength as he'd so often lent her his. And she thought about how love was like fire sometimes. It could destroy if you let it consume you, but it could also forge you stronger, brighter, more resilient than before. All you had to do was be brave enough to step into the flames and trust that something beautiful would rise from the ashes. 6 months after moving in together, Avery sat at her favorite coffee shop, staring at 2 life-changing documents, the final draft of her novel and an email from one of New York's top publishing houses expressing interest in it. You're going to wear a hole in that table, Riley said, sliding a fresh latte in front of her. What's got you so nervous, besides the obvious? Avery glanced at her phone. No messages from Cassian yet. He's reading it now, the whole thing. The book or the email? Both. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug. I've never let anyone read the entire manuscript before, not even my agent. The novel had poured out of her over the past months, shaped by late-night conversations with Cassian, by watching him heal, by her own journey of rediscovery. It wasn't the romance she'd originally planned. Instead, it was a story about transformation, about a woman learning to trust herself again after loss, and a man learning that protecting others meant first making peace with what he couldn't change. Her phone buzzed. Her heart leaped, then settled when she saw it was just Madeline. Stop panicking, he's going to love it. But what if he didn't? What if he read between the lines and saw too much of himself in her male protagonist? What if he thought she'd exploited his pain, his story, his trust? The bell above the door chimed. She looked up to see Cassian walking in, holding her manuscript in one hand and his phone in the other. His expression was unreadable. "Hi," she managed. He sat down across from her, placing the manuscript carefully on the table. "You wrote us." "No," she said quickly. "I mean, yes, you inspired some of it, but it's not exactly Avery." His voice was soft but intense. "You wrote us. Not just the window watching or the falling in love, but the hard parts, the healing parts. The way love doesn't fix you but gives you a safe place to fix yourself." She held her breath. And it's beautiful." He reached for her hand. "It's real and raw and honest. It's everything I've never been able to say about Lauren, about loss, about finding you." Tears pricked her eyes. "Really? Really?" He squeezed her hand. "The publishers. Right, it's going to help people, make them feel less alone." Relief flooded through her. "I was so worried you'd be upset, that I'd crossed a line using parts of your story." "Our story," he corrected gently. "And you didn't just use it, you transformed it, like a phoenix." Riley appeared with Cassian's usual black coffee, then tactfully retreated. Through the windows, they could see their old apartments across the street. New tenants lived there now, creating their own stories behind those windows. "There's something else," Cassian said, pulling an envelope from his jacket. "I was going to wait, make it more romantic, but this feels right." Avery's heart began to race as he slid the envelope across the table. Inside was a photograph she'd never seen before. Lauren in her hospital uniform sitting on a fire truck grinning at the camera. "Turn it over," he said softly. On the back, in Lauren's handwriting, "To my big brother, the bravest man I know. Thank you for always protecting me, but don't forget to live your own life too. Love you forever, Elle." "I found it last week," Cassian said, his voice rough. "Going through her old things for Regina's memory book. She must have written it right. Before..." He took a deep breath. "It feels like permission, you know? To be happy. To move forward." "Cass." Avery's voice wavered. He stood up, then to her absolute shock got down on one knee beside her table. The entire coffee shop went silent. "I've been carrying this around for weeks," he said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "Waiting for the perfect moment. But then I read your book, about how love isn't about perfect moments but about perfect understanding, about how sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let ourselves be happy." Avery's hands flew to her mouth as he opened the box, revealing a simple but stunning ring. "I love you," he said, his dark eyes full of emotion. "I love the way you see me. Not just the strong parts, but the broken ones too. I love how you've helped me remember Lauren with joy instead of just pain. I love that you wrote our story and made it something beautiful." Tears were flowing freely down her face now. Riley was openly filming with their phone. The entire coffee shop seemed to be holding its breath. "Avery Elizabeth Malone," Cassian continued, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Will you marry me? Will you keep writing our story with me, whatever chapters come next?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." The coffee shop erupted in cheers as he slipped the ring onto her finger. When he kissed her, she could taste the salt of happy tears, hers or his, she wasn't sure. "I love you," she murmured against his lips. "All of you, every chapter, every page." Later that evening, they sat in their apartment surrounded by their merged lives. His jazz records, her books, the memory album of Lauren they were building together. The ring caught the light as Avery typed out her response to the publisher. "What are you telling them?" Cassian asked, playing with her hair as she worked. "That their timing is perfect?" She smiled up at him. that sometimes the universe has a way of bringing all the pieces together exactly when they're meant to. Through their windows, they could see the city lights sparkling, but they weren't watching other lives anymore. They were living their own, writing their own story one day at a time. "Read me something," Cassian requested, pulling her close. "From the book?" Avery opened her laptop to the final page. "Love isn't about being saved. It's about finding someone who makes you brave enough to save yourself. Someone who sees both your strength and your scars, and teaches you how to wear them both with pride. Someone who helps you rise from the ashes of who you were, and loves you into who you're becoming. Sometimes that love looks like quiet mornings and shared coffee. Sometimes it looks like holding someone while they face their ghosts. Sometimes it looks like watching through windows until you're brave enough to open the door. But always, it looks like coming home. To yourself, to each other, to the truth that some fires destroy but others transform. And in the end, it's not about what burns away. It's about what rises." Cassian pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. Outside their windows, the city hummed with life and possibility. Inside, they held each other, safe in the knowledge that their story, like all the best ones, was still being written. And this was only the beginning. 1 year later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of their new house, casting warm patterns across the hardwood floors. Avery sat in what they dubbed the writing nook, surrounded by advance copies of her novel, which was set to release next week. The publisher's marketing materials called it a stunning debut about love, loss, and the courage to begin again. But the most important review sat framed on her desk, a simple note from Cassian. "Thank you for telling our story so beautifully." The sound of a key in the front door made her smile. Cassian was home from his shift, right on time for their Saturday morning tradition. "Coffee's ready," she called out. He appeared in the doorway, still in his uniform, holding a familiar paper bag from Been There, Done That. Though they'd moved to this quiet neighborhood a few months after their wedding, Riley still kept their, usual orders ready every Saturday morning. "How was the shift?" she asked as he bent to kiss her. "Quiet, thankfully." He settled into the oversized armchair they'd positioned next to her desk, close enough to touch, but giving her space to work. Though Miguel won't stop showing everyone pictures of the twins. Regina and Miguel's new babies, born just 2 months ago, had the entire fire station wrapped around their tiny fingers, especially Cassian, who'd been named godfather to both girls. "Did you show them the latest sonogram?" Avery asked, hand drifting to her still flat stomach. They hadn't told anyone else about their own expected arrival, wanting to keep the joy between just them for a little longer. Cassian's face softened with that look of wonder he'd worn since the positive test. "Not yet, but I did spend an embarrassing amount of time in the baby supply store on 3rd Street during my lunch break." "Again?" "They had these tiny firefighter onesies." Avery laughed, getting up to settle in his lap. "You're going to spoil this kid rotten, like you haven't already ordered a complete set of baby classics for the nursery." She couldn't deny it. The room that would become their child's nursery was already filling with books, carefully chosen to create the same love of stories that had shaped her life. Among them was a special handmade book, the memory album of Lauren, filled with photos and stories and love, waiting to share the legacy of an aunt who would live on through their stories. "I've been thinking," Cassian said, playing with her wedding ring, a habit he'd developed over the past year. "About names." "Yeah? If it's a girl, what do you think about Lauren?" Avery turned to look at him, seeing the mix of hope and hesitation in his eyes. "Lauren Malone Doyle," she tested the sound. "It's beautiful. You don't think it's too much, too heavy?" "I think it's perfect." She touched his face. A reminder that love doesn't end, it just transforms. Like phoenixes. He pulled her closer, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. Through their new windows, they could see their garden where sunflowers, Lauren's favorites, were just beginning to bloom. Life, moving in cycles of renewal and growth. "The book launch is next week," she said. "Are you ready? To watch my brilliant wife become a best-selling author?" "Absolutely." to share our story with the world, she corrected gently. He was quiet, for a moment considering. You know what? I am. Because it's not just about the pain anymore. It's about what came after. What's still coming. As if in response, the morning light shifted, painting their walls in shades of gold and promise. Avery thought about the journey that had brought them here. From those first tentative glances through windows to this home they'd built together, this life they were creating. I love you, she whispered, feeling his heart beat steady against her back. I love you too, he murmured into her hair. All of you. Everything we've been, everything we're becoming. Outside, the city was waking up. Inside, they held each other, safe in the knowledge that their story, like the best ones, like the truest ones, would keep unfolding. Through new windows, new chapters, new beginnings. And every page would be written in love. We've all seen someone through a window, a neighbor, a stranger, a face that intrigues us. But have you ever felt that inexplicable connection? That moment when a simple glance carries the weight of 1,000 unspoken words? If you could go back in time and have the courage to turn one of those looks into something more, what would your unlived love story be? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.